Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats so our panel can begin.
Thank you all. Good to be here this morning, and I have the pleasure of having a chat here with Adrian Neuhauser, the Chief Executive Officer of Avianca Holdings. But before being CEO, you were CFO. So let's go back in history a little bit and talk about the what challenges you were faced coming in as Chief Financial Officer of Avianca.
Sure, thanks. Thank you all for being here. So I joined Avianca in 2019. A very different company from what it is today, and we'll talk about how, kind of what happened going through the bankruptcy. But it was a company that was a very legacy-focused model, one of the highest cost operators in the region, and in a region where travel has been increasingly democratized, right? And so when you think about what segment of the population flies, Avianca was targeting a very small segment of the population, seeing competitors grow around it. Very difficult capital structure. The company was in a technical default at the time. No cash, high cost structure, difficult relationships with labor. It was a very complicated situation. And we went through basically an out-of-court restructuring in 2019 that cleaned up the balance sheet, but left us with very little collateral as well, right? So we had pledged everything into the structures that we used to finance the company to take us out of the defaults the company was in at the time.
Now, full disclosure, I was the banker for you, so I got you into that trouble. Yes. So we raised about $375 million of new shareholder loans secured by all the rest of what was available in the airline, and set forward into 2020, doing very well, running ahead of business plan. COVID hit, and tell us the story from there.
Well, so we basically had to go into, we were the earliest Latin American company to go into bankruptcy when COVID hit us. And as John, who was our advisor in both the out-of-court and then the Chapter 11 filing, would tell you that we had the challenge we were faced with, and what ultimately became the opportunity was we went into this Chapter 11 situation with no collateral to pledge, with, again, a very difficult cost structure, and with very limited cash. So we were forced to kind of face an existential crisis at the beginning of our Chapter 11, which I think was unique in the region. And it made us really focus on what was important in our business model, what wasn't, redesign ourselves, and really also from just a negotiating and capital structure standpoint, deal with all of the big negotiations with our creditors very, very early in the bankruptcy. Because in order to put together a DIP facility, we basically had to get agreements, waivers, releases from all of the people that we had pledged all our collateral to in prior years and in the prior restructuring. So it forced us to bring people to the table and kind of deal with most of the difficult Chapter 11 negotiations very early in the bankruptcy. So we did two things really. We restructured our business plan around a very, very cost-focused carrier. So if you look at Avianca right now, when we went into bankruptcy, we were 6.2 cents CASK ex-fuel. We're currently run rate slightly over 4.5. We'll be 4 by the end of the year. And we're projecting somewhere between 3 and 3.4 by the end of next year. So very, very lean, higher utilization, higher density seating, a much more disaggregated product where people can basically choose, if they want a meal, if they want a premium seat, et cetera, but where we're lowering costs by really kind of unbundling. And so there's the business model change, but also the capital structure change where we just brought in everyone in very early. So our emergence was very kind of streamlined and subtle, right? We came out at the end of last year without many challenges to our emergence because, again, we had the ability to, or the obligation, the need to really negotiate that very early in the bankruptcy.
Yeah, and just to put it in context, the amount of capital that had to be raised for financing this was over $2 billion. going into that Chapter 11, which we didn't have, and then coming out 2.7 billion.
2.7.
Leaving a lot of cash now finally on the balance sheet, about 3 or 4 times the historical high, right?
This is a company that used to run with about $300 million of available cash. We came out with close to 1.2 billion. So a very different liquidity situation, very different cost situation, much longer maturities in our obligations, and just a very different airline.
So one of the things that I think really has not been covered by the aviation media is the fact that what you have going on now is that further transformation of the cost structure down to the levels that you mentioned a moment ago, which means you have a low-cost carrier that also has wide-body international operations. You want to talk about that complexity and sort of hybrid business model that few have been able to achieve?
Yeah, look, I think one of the things that happened when we stared at our business model, right, when we in this emergency Chapter 11 filing, was trying to determine who we would be in the future and what market we were servicing. And one of the acknowledgments that we had to make is, look, we are in a low-income region of the world where people are extremely price sensitive. That's why we had been losing market share for a long time. Trying to price our way through our incremental costs was just impossible, right? We had to offer service at a price that was competitive with what people did. So that turned our head into, okay, we have to be a more cost-focused, low-cost carrier model. And then the obvious answer is, okay, well, then you want a single fleet type, you want the simplicity of those things. The problem is, when you actually looked at our network, some of our most profitable parts of the network are our franchise from Colombia to Europe and our franchise from Colombia to the West Coast of the US, both of which have been very strong historically, and both of which need wide bodies for range. Bogota is a very high altitude airport, so you can't really get full range out of narrow bodies. So then we said, okay, well now, how do we think about keeping this? And it's been a very interesting kind of evolution, because you're always seeing complexity want to seep back into the model. And what happens if we move wide bodies into other routes, and what happens if we do this, if we do that? The way we designed it is basically, we keep wide bodies where the only choice is wide bodies, and the rest of the network is single fleet type Airbus 320s, a combination of CEOs and NEOs that we're migrating into NEOs over time.
One of the underpinnings of the restructuring was, in fact, striking a deal with your pilot group. Mm-hmm. How did they come about?
Well, so one of the things that happens, the old saying, it's a cliche, but never let a good crisis go to waste, right? When our bankruptcy was truly an existential crisis. And so all of a sudden you're faced with a situation where the creditors, even the ones who had collateral, right, the ones that had worked with us in the out-of-court restructuring, but everybody's looking at this situation where the entire aviation sector in the world is in crisis. Latin America is one of the deeper crises. In our particular case, both of our hubs were shut down by the governments. El Salvador and Colombia both basically stopped passenger flights, right? So we had no flights. The sector's in crisis. We are in a crisis where we can't just finance our way through it because we have no collateral to give people. And so all of a sudden the people that had a collateral position are saying, well, that collateral may not be worth as much as I think in a crisis in the world. Our pilots are thinking, well, I can't push this so hard that we put ourselves out of employment. Our unsecured holders, even more the case, lessors, even more the case. So everybody all of a sudden, just to put it in simple terms, everybody's moved from greed mode to fear mode, right? Everybody understands that if we don't reach broad consensus here, the company is going to literally liquidate. And it's, as we always say, it's the oldest operating airline in the world, right? It's over 100 years old, continuously operating. Second oldest if you go back to when it was founded. We're going to go on 103 years old now. So it's got a long history and a reason to exist. It is the key supplier of connectivity in Colombia, and Colombia is a very, very dependent market on air travel because of its geography. So everybody sort of came together and sat at a table where they weren't willing to sit before. And so we were able to get very, very successful terms from creditors, from creditors, from lessors, from suppliers, that then allowed us to get interesting terms on kind of the incremental capital raise we did. But it also brought to the table our pilots, where the company had a very, very bad relationship with the pilots going back to a strike that happened about 6 years ago now. And so it let us work through that in a difficult kind of dynamic, because we had to basically grab the bull by the horns and go deal with the pilot association that had led the strike. We reached an agreement with them that gives us ongoing savings and really kind of aligns their interests with us for the next 3 or 4 years, but also has dramatically changed the relationship. So we're working with them really closely now. The agreement has been sort of a living agreement where they've continued to flex on some terms of their legacy agreement. It's their original labor agreement dates back to the 40s. It's one of the oldest agreements in airlines that's active today. They're very reticent to permanently modify it. So we keep kind of amending it and doing these changes, but they've moved into a dynamic where they're working with us, where they understand they need to flex. We're working together. We've given back some of the original concessions, and it's a very, very different relationship. It's working really well.
So current trends, how are you doing? Where are you going? And then I want to just touch briefly on strategic moves, because you've been busy on that front too.
Sure. So current trends, we are exactly in line with the business plan that you helped us put together. In terms of costs, we're, again, second quarter CASK ex-fuel was 4.8 cents. Run rate by the end of the year is going to be 4 cents. And frankly, we're ahead if you think about which initiatives have happened, haven't. One of the recurring themes I'm sure you're hearing in this conversation is there's still supply chain issues everywhere. So densification and kind of redoing the cabins, which is a key part of our cost reduction, is actually running behind schedule. In spite of that, we're in line with trends. So all of that's in line. We've obviously been impacted by high fuel and by what that's meant in terms of being able to pass it through in pricing and the effects on elasticity. We recovered about 40% of the fuel differential second quarter. First quarter, we were ahead of business plan. Second quarter put us kind of to business plan in terms of cash generation because of the fall in, because of the inability to fully recover. We're now recovering about 100%. July was actually 99% according to our math. So we're moving into closer to fuel recovery, but with reduced demand, right? So we're having to adjust to that. So in general, well, and I think the key long-term tenet of our plan, which is to be competitive in costs, we're completely in line.
Strategically, you've got made some news recently, with Viva in Colombia.
Yeah, so Viva. So strategically, we're big proponents of consolidation, not just within markets, but kind of across the region. Our largest competitor, LATAM, sort of sets the footprint of what the competitive base is for the region, right? And they have the ability to hedge themselves between markets, to move capacity from one market to another, et cetera. So we think that's kind of the cross-market consolidation is an essential piece of it. Within markets, we made an investment in Viva. Viva was our largest low-cost competitor in Colombia, where it's a very strange investment that Colombian law allows you to do, where we basically purchase 100% of the economics of the equity, but we cannot control it or involve ourselves in management or even have managerial information. And that investment was made prior to the spike in fuel and the devaluation of the Colombian peso that have occurred. So the two of those have put them in a much weaker position than I think they foresaw or we foresaw when the deal was done. So they're in a bit of a and in the meantime, obviously, the fact that we're their biggest competitor, our costs are coming down, and we're therefore able to be closer to them in terms of effective pricing, also squeezes their margins. So between those two things, they're in a difficult cash situation now, and we've asked the Colombian government for antitrust approval to actually take control of them. So we'll see how that progresses, but that's an ongoing discussion.
And Sky?
Sky is, Sky speaks to what I mentioned, which is ultimately we think there needs to be a balancing of the map against our largest regional competitor. So for now, Sky's a financial investment. We have a convertible investment that our shareholders actually made into them during the crisis that allowed them to fund themselves. That converts into about 42% of their equity, and anything that we want to do there that's more strategic requires antitrust approval from the Chilean authorities, and obviously we have an interest in that, so we may move forward and request that in the near future.
Well, our time is up, but thank you, Adrian, for sharing all that with us.
Great. Thank you so much for hosting us. Thank you, everyone. Great. Thank you.